So I'm very pleased to be here. I'm from Berkeley. I think the commute made me realize why the Berkeley-Stanford connections aren't as strong. But I get it. I get it. So I just want to thank Sean Reardon and Emmanuel for delivering excellent, and fascinating work with new data. I'm going to be trying to give you more of a tour of issues around the central role that schools play in the transmission of economic success from one generation to the next, but actually going back in time using older data actually to build our understanding of the lessons learned from the past. And part of this is going to be structured in which I have kind of a few major pieces that I'm going to try to pull together. First, I'm going to try to, I guess this audience well knows that the degree of persistence and economic status across generations is very high in the U.S., particularly in the lower tail of the distribution. That's true across health status as well. And yet, what I'm going to document is a significant degree of black-white differences in upward mobility across every part of the parental income percentile range, but also document a sharp increase in generational income mobility among African Americans among successive cohorts born between 1955 and 1979. And what's important about this is that even among poor children, there are substantial racial differences in the exposure or childhood exposure to concentrated poverty neighborhoods. Black students are significantly more likely to attend high poverty schools, and what I'm going to be trying to do is attempt to explain this why black-white mobility differences narrowed significantly for these successive cohorts born between 1955 and 1979. And I'm going to be focusing on the role that these three key equal opportunity policies played. First, school desegregation, and second, school finance reforms, and third, the rollout and expansions of early preschool investments through Head Start. And I'm going to be focusing on the cohorts that were born that straddle these periods, that were born in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, using the wide variation in the timing of each of these major equal education opportunity policies and what impacts it had on paths of mobility and why and to what degree it can explain this significant convergence that we witnessed in earlier generations of cohorts that were differentially exposed to these policies. So by a tour, what I mean is I'm going to kind of go more into giving you an aerial view summary of each of these as opposed to going into great detail in any one of them, just so that you can kind of get a piece of what I'm going to be going through here. Okay? So when we say a significant degree of economic persistence across generations, children born in the bottom quintile in childhood, 42% of them remain poor as adults. Many in this room, Raj and Emmanuel, certainly provided a much more clear descriptive portrait of the geography of opportunity that we've been able to really build on in the more recent cohorts. But what I'm going to be doing is going back in time, using the panel study of income dynamics, linking three generations of adult outcomes that have been linked from birth to adulthood, and focusing on cohorts born between 1945 and 1979 that have all been followed at least into their 30s and beyond, and with data up through 2013, from looking at a whole array of adult outcomes, economic status, SCS, health status outcomes, but where the data is linked to the census block in childhood, and where I have the kind of full residential histories from birth to adulthood. And what's going to be kind of important about this is simply that I'm going to construct measures of permanent income for both generations for the parents' income, as well as the adult incomes of their children, using a set of measures of permanent income. And I'm going to be talking about roughly 13,540 individuals. The oversampling of both African Americans and low-income children give me sizable samples, 5,000 some odd and almost 7,300 low-income children in the sample. And that's going to be drawn from 4,735 childhood families, from roughly 1,570 school districts, over 1,200 counties, and I'm matching them to their childhood school districts pre-reform. And what I'm really going to be examining is how policy-induced changes in school resource inputs in the early childhood and K through 12 years, comparing policy-induced changes across cohorts within the same district and between districts for the same cohorts, and looking at those policy-induced changes in exposure on generational mobility outcomes. Okay? Now, the first piece of this, though, is first trying to describe the extent of generational mobility. And now, what's important about this piece is, from a measurement standpoint, the most commonly used measure of intergenerational mobility is the intergenerational elasticity, as everyone knows. But it's not well suited for kind of trying to document group differences, in my case, black-white differences in mobility with respect to the entire income distribution comprising both blacks and whites. And moreover, it doesn't really allow for a descriptive, detailed picture of which individuals are moving up and which individuals are moving down in the income distribution. And so the intergenerational elasticity provides a limited view on the extent of mobility and the persistence of economic status across generations at different points of the income distribution. And so what I'm going to do is use measures of upward mobility that compare the relative positions of parents and children in the income distribution of each respective generation. And building on the work of Bosch and Mazumder, recent contributions, I'm using this upward mobility measure. In particular, this upward mobility measure is simply describing the likelihood that an individual will pass their parents' position in the income distribution by a given amount, conditional on their parents being at or below a given percentile. And so I'm going to be looking at Y1 represents the children's subsequent rank position in the percentile rank in their generation relative to that of their parents. And the tau is going to represent, obviously, when tau is 0, it's simple. It's just a simple, did you surpass the economic position in your generation than that of your parents? And then I'm going to be looking at when tau is 0.2, and I'm going to call that substantial generational mobility, where you exceed that of your parents' percentile rank in your generation's respective distribution by 20 percentile points. And so I'm going to be looking at generational changes in the rank position in the respective generation's income distribution as a dependent variable, as well as these kind of upward rank mobility tendencies. And the other thing I can do is use intervals rather than cumulative. So I can look at, among children that were born in the bottom quartile, among children that were born in the bottom half of the income distribution, but also ranges of that. And I'm going to construct those via measures of permanent family income for each generation to construct these measures of these mobility measures. And what's going to be important is for every individual, I'm going to use the multi-year average of parental income when they were ages 12 to 17 for the parent estimate of the permanent income. And then for the children, I'm going to use multi-year measures between the ages of 28 to 40 to create permanent income estimates for the children's subsequent adult income. And then I'm going to then show the generational link in terms of constructing these rank mobility measures. Okay? Now, when we do this, this is for the probability that your parents, that you surpass that of your parents. So let's just look at that once more. The first is showing that for whites. And across every percentile income range, we see a significant black-white difference in the likelihood of surpassing the rank position in the income distribution of that of your parents. And that is something that we see throughout. And we see that for, the likelihood of upward mobility surpassing. And we also see that when we look at substantial mobility. So substantial mobility is a 20 percentage point increase relative to that of your parents. And again, we see that significant difference in the black-white difference in the likelihood of substantial upward mobility. And we're talking about, roughly 0.15, a 15 percentage point difference in that gap, okay, throughout the income distribution. And so the question really concerns, to what degree is that due to the extent of segregation and the fact that African Americans tend to go to different schools and be in concentrated poverty neighborhoods, and in what ways have policies that have lessened those unequal educational opportunities that accrue from that impacted this narrowing of those generational mobility gaps, okay? So the one thing about this is to look at the year of birth variation. So to look at this upward mobility set of estimates. This is just the likelihood that you surpass that of your parents conditional on being born in the bottom half of the income distribution by race and year of birth. And what's interesting is there's not really a significant change that we see for whites, okay? But with each successive cohort from 1955 in particular to 1979, there's a significant narrowing of that generational income mobility likelihood that we see. And we see that pattern both for any upward mobility, and we also see it for the degree of mobility, that is the amount of mobility in terms of the likelihood of substantial mobility, okay? And it's really those keys with regard to changes in the black-white changes in these mobility patterns for successive cohorts that is going to be part of how I'm going to be at least trying to explain the role that school and equal educational opportunity policies played in narrowing any of these gaps. Now, this is just the point that you see these patterns for the likelihood of substantial upward mobility, where we see, again, for successive cohorts, particularly in late 50s, successive cohorts through the 70s, we see that significant narrowing of the likelihood of substantial upward mobility. And so it's those kind of descriptive pieces that I'm then kind of using the design of the timing of school desegregation, school finance reform, and Head Start in different research designs to try to examine what role that played. Are we okay? Okay, thanks. Okay, so this is just a point that this measure is looking at generational change in income rank, holding constant, conditional on being born in the bottom half of the income distribution by race and year of birth. So a number of different measures of upward mobility, we see a very similar picture of significant convergence beginning in the 60s, 70s, cohorts that differentially were more increasingly exposed to investments. Usually we talk about government investments within the kind of the school context. So generally, when we kind of think about this set of folks that are going through these equal education opportunity policies, you have to kind of contextualize the actual degree of concentrated poverty that was pervasive in 1960. And here we see the concentration of poverty, particularly in the South, where in dark red represents more than 45% of households in those counties are poor. And we see that the 300 poorest counties are disproportionately in the South. And that certainly is also characterizing where a concentration of African Americans are in 1960. Now, all of that is to say that what I'm going to be trying to do is examine the implementation of school desegregation plans within schools. And what's important is that while on the eve of the Brown decision, there's a clear regional pattern where in pink we see where legal segregation is required, in green we see where legal segregation is permitted, where yellow we see legal segregation is prohibited, in purple no specific legislation on segregation. So there's, including the District of Columbia where legal segregation is required. So that's where we started, but there was just a wide degree of variation in the timing of school desegregation implementation, and most school desegregation implementation didn't occur without an actual court order. And so when we look at, it wasn't really till the Civil Rights Act of '64 put teeth in enforcement that we saw significant movement with regard to actual integration plans being enacted and significant school integration efforts actually taking hold. So most of the kind of court orders occurred between post 64, many between 68 and 72, so that by the end of 72, the South is actually more integrated than the rest of the country. And so it's this timing, the quasi-random variation in that timing, that I'm going to be using to examine how mobility patterns across cohorts within the same district and across districts from those from the same cohorts impacted these generational mobility rates. So just looking at the timing, this is 54, 59, roughly very little happened in that first decade after Brown. Very little, let's just go back. Very little happened really in that first decade after Brown, and then there was a significant uptick post-1964, so that we see a significant birth cohort variation in childhood exposure, and it's that variation that I'm going to exploit, that those cohorts that were born in the late 40s, early 50s, mostly went through completely segregated schools. By cohorts born in the late 60s, early 70s, a significant share of those children in their school-age years were in districts that were under some kind of court-ordered school desegregation plan. So I'm kind of looking and testing for using the variation in both the timing of implementation of desegregation implementation as well as school finance reform, as well as the intensity. That is the degree to which these policies changed the actual school resource inputs. So I have in mind 3 major pathways through which desegregation could have impacted school resource input and school quality more generally. One is through the more pure effects channel, through the school segregation. One is through the kind of school resource inputs through per pupil spending, class size, and school resource equalization type pathways. And the other is just simply through some type of parental, teacher, community level expectations for child achievement. So I'm looking at these kind of ways in which our cohorts, improvements across cohorts that are larger in districts that experience a larger increase in school resource inputs, and looking at kind of what these mechanisms may look like. So the hypothesized paths that I'm trying to examine are, I'm looking at cohorts from the same district but who are already older than 18 or older at the time that the reform occurred, whether it's school finance reform or Head Start. Actually, for this, it's the school desegregation or school finance reform. And then I'm comparing that with partially exposed cohorts for which the reform happened sometime during their school-age years, but they weren't exposed to these reforms throughout their school-age years, and then contrasting that with those who were entering kindergarten and therefore were exposed to these reforms throughout their school-age years. And I'm examining whether the actual impacts and improved mobility outcomes were significantly augmented by both the duration, in other words, the treatment intensity is both the duration of exposure as well as the intensity of the school resource change that accompanied that policy, okay? So the first thing to kind of think about, the first stage of thinking about what school resource inputs were affected by these policies, first looking at school desegregation, the first is more obvious that we first find no pre-existing time trend, but a significant decline in the black-white dissimilarity index, about a 25 percentage point decline. In 1968, for the average district, it was around 0.68, suggesting that about almost 70% of black students would have to move to a different school within the district for there to be racial balance. We saw a significant decline following court orders. So year that you were age 17 minus the year of the initial court order, whenever that's negative, that represents cohorts for whom they were already 18 or older at the time that these were implemented. Now, you see it not just on school integration, but even non-racial aspects of integration in the form of increased per pupil spending. And we see this primarily through the fact that precisely at the time when these districts were desegregating, districts that had a significant minority enrollment, states actually infused significant dollars to those districts to enable those districts to level up spending to the level that whites were already getting. Because what you want to remember is that prior to these school desegregation efforts, in most cases, the district level spending was disproportionately allocated to the majority white districts. So integration also represented an equalization of school resources in a fundamental way that on average led to significant declines in class size for blacks with no significant changes for whites. So I then began to examine, well, what effects do we see on outcomes? Again, using the PSID, and then focusing only on those places that at some point would undergo a court-ordered school desegregation plan so that I could just use the quasi-random variation in the timing to isolate these mobility effects. And what we see after controlling for a whole host, you have school district fixed effects, region-specific time trends, controlling for the timing of hospital desegregation. In this first case, Head Start spending, Title I, the timing of kindergarten introduction, the whole host of expansions of safety net programs that are also important determinants of these mobility patterns, but those are all things going to be accounted for in the model. Medicaid, AFDC, food stamps, community health centers, those are all important policies that are coincident here, but that my impacts are independent of those pieces. So what you see first, just on education, right, is no pre-existing time trend. This is a non-parametric estimates, but significant increases in educational attainment for successive cohorts so that you see basically a full year, additional year of education completed for African Americans that were exposed throughout their school age years relative to cohorts that were 18 at the time of the initial court order and therefore were not exposed during their school age years those gains did not come at the expense of whites. And so I'm kind of going through this quickly. Remember I said it's going to be a quick tour. Okay, so we're trying to get to like what all of this means for mobility. So I'm just showing you the kind of quick snapshot pictures. We see a significant decline in the annual incidence of adult poverty among African Americans with no changes for whites. Again, that these increases in both the quality and the quantity of completed education are mirrored in significant increases in economic status in adulthood that I will then show increase mobility, but also significantly reduce the annual incidence of poverty in adulthood. We're talking about a 20 percentage point decline in the annual incidence of poverty relative for those cohorts that were exposed throughout their school age years relative to children from the same districts, but who were not exposed during those years, during their school age years. So when you look at on the effects of generational mobility, remember I led with this to show you the birth year by race variation in mobility rates for successive cohorts of between 1950 and 1979. And these are cohorts that really straddle the period in which there's significant variation in exposure. And what you see is, again, when we're looking at generational changes in the rank of the income distribution for comparing respective cohorts relative to their generation's rank. Again, no effects for whites, but we see a pretty significant increase in the change in the generational rank and the income distribution that is associated with these years of exposure to desegregation. And part of that is certainly being driven in part by this kind of school spending resource equalization that's playing a significant role, okay? But kind of to look more explicitly at the role that school spending may play, I'm gonna examine school finance reform. And this work is joint with my colleague Harabo Jackson in Northwestern, where we build a whole case inventory of every kind of known school finance reform from 1972 to 2010, legislative ones, court-ordered ones, and kind of build a way to kind of categorize a taxonomy of school funding formula types, okay? So basically, the key thing about school finance reform and its timing is that 29 states' Supreme Courts have overturned local school, state school systems and implemented some kind of major school funding formula equalization plan that were aimed to try to lessen and weaken the strength of the relationship between the wealth of a district and its per pupil spending. Because it's really the historically high degree of reliance on the local property tax base that allowed and coupled with the residential segregation, significant residential segregation by race and economic status that has continued to increase, that kind of exacerbated the ability for poor districts to raise revenue to fund schools. So the school finance reform movement was really kind of ignited by that kind of interest in trying to lessen educational opportunity differences that were coming from spending differences. And most states really have experienced some change over this time period, and many without having a court order. A lot of legislative reforms, and there's really two waves of this. There's the equity-based cases that happened really pre-1990, and then the adequacy-based cases that kind of more emphasized reforms that would increase the amount of spending for low-income districts. And what's interesting about this is when you use the policy-induced change that's coming straight, induced solely by the court order, okay? I'm not going through all the time and the data that undergirds kind of the timing of how we're able to categorize these reforms, but there's many numbers of data sets that we've linked together so that we have a consistent panel dating back from the mid-60s to 2010, a consistent panel of school district data that then we map onto the timing of the timing and the type of school funding formula change. So even though school finance reform is one policy under an umbrella, how states pursue the implementation of these school funding formula changes is far from uniform. And so we categorized 4 different types of funding formulas that really had different economic incentives and had different, therefore, impacts in narrowing gaps between rich and poor districts as well as the overall level of those changes. I'm not going to spend too much time really on the funding formula types at this, just in the interest of time, but I'm certainly happy to discuss those pieces. But really from the identification strategy, what we're doing is simply trying to isolate exogenous variation in school spending that was induced by these school finance reforms so that we can use and leverage that exogenous variation that's coming from the timing of school finance reform as well as the type of funding formula that was in place where the predicted impact of those changes depended both on the wealth or the income of your district as well as the district level spending relative to state spending in 1972. And this is all kind of net of district-specific and region-specific fixed effects. So we're able to kind of get a prediction of the policy-induced reform spending change for every district based on their baseline position in the state income distribution, the timing of the reform, and the type of funding formula change, as well as the baseline district spending prior to any court-mandated reform. And so a lot of details around how we create this instrument, a lot of robustness checks we do, but the point for all of this is really our ability to isolate this variation so that we can kind of distinguish what impacts we are getting from any pre-existing time trends that may give alternative explanations for the results. And it's really the variation over time where cohorts are differentially exposed to these policies, but also some districts experienced a larger policy-induced increase than others. And we're basically comparing within cohort differences to between cohort differences. And one of the things that's important is that it's not just the spending that matters, but we also find that that spending was allocated and a significant amount made it to the classroom in the form of increased instructional expenditures. So we find that these court-ordered school finance reforms, plausibly exogenous, led to significant reductions in the student-to-teacher ratio, class size, led to longer school years, and significant increases in teacher salaries. And that's one of the things that we think explain why they ended up having significant impacts on outcomes. In particular, I'm going to be talking about mobility outcomes today. So for this subset of analyses, I'm really going to be focusing on the outcomes of cohorts born between 55 and 85. And yes, okay. So one other quick piece about this is that I wanted to examine the interactive effects of both the pre-K through Head Start spending and the K through 12 changes in spending that accompanied school finance reform. And so I'm going to be linking those pieces so that you can see that together, that those changes in the pre-K spending changes coming from Head Start, followed with the kind of K through 12 changes from school finance reform that together led to a set of dynamic complementarities economists refer to, where the increases in educational spending led the subsequent changes in K through 12 spending to have much more effects on generational mobility. When those K through 12 spending changes happened, preceded by these increases in Head Start. So one of the things that is nice about this window of opportunity of examining these policy changes is that they were happening in close proximity. And the rollout of Head Start is actually something that's happening at a rapid rate in these early years. So that I'm using the rollout of Head Start in the first 15 years of the 10 to 15 years of the program, but that actually overlaps many of these other policy changes in the K through 12 years that creates a nice window of comparing districts in their kind of effects, but still within cohort. So here you can just see the changes. I'm going to just show you this more quickly via maps. So this is 1965. This is where we started. The 300 poorest counties were where there was an emphasis toward Head Start placement. But we see basically that's the timing of when Head Start and where Head Start places rolled out. Again, the blue representing where Head Start locations were. And it's really that variation in the changing geographic availability of Head Start for residentially immobile families where they could enroll their youngest child but not their oldest child. And it's using that variation to examine impacts. And again, what we find is that the increase in Head Start spending, if it didn't happen when you were actually age eligible, that is 4 years old, we don't really see any change in outcomes. So if you were in that district and the Head Start spending occurred when you were 6, 7, 8, 9, we don't see any real change in education spending. So it's a nice kind of placebo test. We see significant increases in change in years of education when it happened when you were age eligible, okay? But importantly, in terms of this interactive effect, that when there's a $1,000 increase in Head Start spending, as well as a school finance reform 10% increase in K through 12 spending, we see a 0.75 increase in poor children's educational attainment. And that is together a huge impact over and above, say, the impact of the K through 12, a 10% increase in K through 12 evaluated at average Head Start spending. And then what's important about thinking about the long-run effects of preschool investments is that we find that the relationship between pre-K investments for the same $1,000 per pupil per 4-year-old increase in Head Start spending, that we see a significant larger impact when it's followed by a higher degree of K through 12 spending. And so we're kind of then documenting in part that the efficacy of early childhood programs also depends on the quality of subsequent investments. And we kind of see that that efficacy of productivity of preschool spending depends in part on those subsequent investments. And we're seeing that pattern in the data. And again, you see it as well when we're looking at poverty. These are, again, effects that are particularly pronounced among poor kids, where we see no change in kind of the annual incidence of adult poverty when those Head Start spending aren't happening when they're actually age eligible, but a significant reduction when it's happening when they are at age 4. And again, we're talking about a 11 percentage point reduction in the annual incidence of adult poverty for poor kids when they experience both a $1,000 increase in per 4-year-old spending and K through 12 10% spending increase. And when we're just looking at the K through 12 spending increase, that's a significant impact throughout their, we're talking about a 10% spending increase throughout their K through 12 years, evaluate the average Head Start spending. But again, when we're just doing the Head Start $1,000 increase, but they're subsequently attending schools that are below average spending in the K through 12 years, we're not seeing this kind of bang for the buck even though it's that same investment. So when we kind of go back to this conversation about the effects on generational ability, because I realize I'm very close to out of time, what I just want you to kind of see is, well, I guess this is the non-parametric estimates from the school finance reform on generational ability. But let me just show you the kind of summary tables. The first point is the outcome here is the generational change in relative rank in the income distribution, where I'm looking at the number of years that you were exposed to school finance reform, and importantly, how large that change in spending was for your district. And then I'm using the instrumented school spending in the K through 17 years from that school finance reform change, and showing the association between that instrumented change in spending and then the county Head Start spending per 4-year-old, and showing that the generational change in relative rank is significantly associated with both the K through 12 spending policy induced as well as the kind of rollout of Head Start, particularly for poor kids, that this effect is significantly larger for poor kids, which is what we would expect, that not only was the change in policy directed and targeted at those children, but also that the effects for a given change was more pronounced for poor kids relative to other kids. So when we look at kids born into the bottom half of the income distribution, those effects are largest there. Okay. Finally, that when we look at those relationships in terms of the generational change in the relative rank in the income distribution, that there's a significant interaction effect between the level of the Head Start spending at age 4 per 4-year-old and the instrumented policy-induced school spending change. So it's not just the county Head Start spending, the instrumented school spending from school finance reform that significantly increases the amount of upward mobility, but it's also the interaction between the two that causes the whole, that is the total spending, to be much more than the sum of the parts. So this is just an important part about interactive effects between Head Start, dynamic complementarity between pre-K and K through 12 spending on the intergenerational mobility prospects of low-income children. And I guess I'll end with that just to say, given in the interest of time so that we can open up, just to say, I know I've gone far too fast to be able to convey the kind of essence of what we're trying to convey here, but I would say that one of the key pieces is highlighting the central role that schools play in the transmission of economic success from one generation to the next. And it's also showing the evidence that the footprints of paths toward upward mobility are preceded by access to high quality schools, as proxied here by the amount of school resources in the pre-K through K through 12, early childhood through 12th grade. And that these school reforms a generation ago, at least in this first generation suite of these equal educational opportunities, expanded on-ramps to poor and more minority children to get on that path. And what is important about this is that the magnitude of these gaps suggests that school resources at both the pre-K and K through 12 level play an important role in structuring the quality of provision of school quality in these respects. We find a 1% increase in per pupil spending increases adult wages by 1% for children from poor families, and has a significant impact at breaking the cycle of poverty from one generation to the next. So I will stop there, and I apologize for the tour of speed, but I just was trying to give you a flavor for how we're kind of synthesizing this work across multiple papers. Thank you. Questions? Yes.
Hi, thank you very much. I was a kindergarten teacher for 3 years, so this area really interests me. I have a question about like the implications of your research for policy. So when we think about the rising inequality that we're seeing today and how education is often listed as the solution for inequality, right, called the great equalizer. But as so long as we live in a society where someone always has to be at the bottom, what are the implications for school and upward mobility? I understand by income and race these implications, but when someone always has to be at the bottom, how can school be a tool for mobility?
So I think the process that determines the outcomes is important. So I think the issue is more about if you start off behind, what's the likelihood that you escape poverty, for example? If you start off in a school setting or an environment that doesn't offer high quality pre-K, what are the kind of likelihoods that you fall behind on the achievement gap? So I think that the data from earlier today kind of give you a very clear picture on the kind of contemporary achievement gap and kind of, I think, suggest a number of directions that we can pursue. But I kind of disagree with the notion that because we have inequality and we're going to always have some measure of inequality, that we don't have to consider that the nature of inequality that reinforces. See, I think what I took away from some of Sean's and even Raj and Emmanuel's earlier work is that the significant geographic variation in upward mobility prospects suggests that there is an important policy role that education policy could play a significant role in narrowing those gaps. And so this earlier generation certainly suggests that that was the case. And whether that can be projected into today's contemporary landscape that is much more an economic achievement gap or class gap is, I think still wait to be determined.
With the nature of policy as it relates to education today. So in talking about Brown v. Board or Head Start, that's a pretty simple policy compared to something like No Child Left Behind. And in thinking about systems and how they have been able to evade policy and increasing segregation in urban districts, what are your kind of impressions about policy implications moving forward so we can see the upward mobility that you've observed in the past?
So I don't think of school desegregation nor school finance reform nor even Head Start as like so simple. I think that I gave you kind of an aerial view of like what overall patterns look like as if every Head Start program is of equal quality and of equal spending per pupil. And the fact is that there's huge differences in the quality of these programs. And therefore, it's actually less surprising that we don't find consistent patterns of effects that is like some uniform kind of effect of Head Start because they vary a lot in the quality of provision. And moreover, most of our school resource equity measures focus on per pupil spending, and if they have any teacher credentials, like what proportion of the district's teachers have a master's degree, that we've seen to be very weakly related to achievement. So the question is more, how could we incorporate value-added measures of teacher quality and to kind of give a better picture of how the distribution of teacher quality, even from the pre-K level, impacts these outcomes. And there are things that money can buy, but in our current structure of kind of hiring teachers, there's not right now a lot of latitude for which you can kind of have a different kind of teacher salary scale that is associated with performance in the classroom. So I think that these are part of that. And while I didn't mention teacher quality, we recognize that within each one of these programs, teacher quality is a key component of probably what transformed these outcomes and I don't think that that's different today. I don't know if that fully answers the question, but it's certainly how I view it. I don't view those things as separable. Yes.
Thanks for the presentation. I had a question just in terms about the black-white differences, because you started off with that in the earlier slides, but in this last set, when you're looking at the Head Start and the K through 12 spending, were those focused on black-white effects, or just in general with?
Yeah, so those were focused, I would say the school finance reform was certainly just focused on poor kids, right, because the target of the program was that. But I think part of it is simply that the disproportionate share of African Americans who are poor caused that demographic group to disproportionately be affected by those policy changes, and they're growing up in more concentrated poverty areas. So these three policies had significant impacts on the black-white gap, in part because they both targeted poor and also minority children. So certainly, school desegregation is focusing on redistributing school children, whereas the other two are focusing on redistributing resources. One's focusing on race, one's focusing on money, but the point is that both are part of the nexus that contribute to unequal educational opportunities before these policies were pursued. And I guess as I was showing you these initial black-white differences in mobility, upward mobility, I was only suggesting that those policies played a dominant role in leading to that convergence. Now, we've seen in the post-80 period, there hasn't been, that convergence stopped pretty abruptly post-1980, and so we've had kind of a similar intergenerational mobility since then. Yes, questions? Yes.
Thank you for your presentation. I very much agree with you that the teacher's quality is very important element for kids' the education achievement. In the LA low-income school district, 80% of the students are from the Latino families. But a very devoted, dedicated teacher, he got his whole class to surpass the AP calculus exam. And I have my personal experience in Palo Alto. So my two kids goes to a public school in Palo Alto, and I found that my sixth grader girl, her math level is 2 grades below than her peers in China. Yeah, and I spent lots of time thinking why the math education is so weak here, and why the Palo Alto high school students are so stressful, which is nationally famous. I think that's because the elementary school here doesn't prepare the students where for the middle school student education, and the middle school education doesn't prepare the kids where for the high school education. So that's why they're so stressful. And I examine and I look at my kids' case. I found that the teaching is good and the assignment, the math homework assignment is good. And the problem is that the teachers never check their homework for others. So the students have no way to improve their math skills from the homework. And I found this is the same case with the elementary school here. So many school teachers just don't check their students' homework. So the students cannot improve their math capability. So I just want to point out that the teachers' dedication is one of the most critical elements for the students' achievement.
I agree. Yes. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Some of the studies that I've seen on Head Start say that although there are beneficial immediate effects, those effects diminish over time. And some researchers seem to suggest that that's because of the quality of the primary education that those students are offered. So I'm wondering how you control for that and what you found of those studies.
Well, so I think that's indeed the point. That, well, first of all, the fade out is really on test scores. Okay? But even when there has been fade out with regard to test score gains, that research has shown that there still has been long-term effects on educational attainment, on adult earnings, on incarceration, on criminal involvement. So even kind of the non-cognitive skill development, there are different dimensions of outcomes where even when there has been test score fade out, still that has not negated huge impacts on these longer-term adult economic outcomes. Okay? But the more important point that relates to the work I'm showing here is that the work also suggests that the fade out, or at least the impacts of these investments in the pre-K period are much less likely to have lasting impacts when the K through 12 school environment is under-resourced. So the kind of point about fade out that relates, at least in part, though suggestive, suggests that that likelihood of fade out is more likely when they're being followed up by worse K through 12 environments. So the question is like, do you want to attribute the fade out effect wholly to the Head Start program as opposed to kind of recognizing the human capital investment kind of dynamic complementarity aspects that affect later life outcomes? And so we're trying to pull together not just the pre-K, but recognizing the interconnectedness and interrelated effects of the pre-K and the K through 12 years using exogenous variation in each stage-specific period to document. So I think that this is certainly related to fade out, though we don't have information on test scores to explicitly test whether we can explain that. But I would just make mention that the uneven estimates of Head Start across areas is in part the unequal quality of these pre-K programs, in part probably related to the amount of spending per 4-year-old in these programs, which is pretty vast. Okay. I'm just going to end with this one statistic because I think it's relevant for this point about concentrated poverty that Sean Reardon was talking about. We see today that 45% of black students attend schools in which more than 3/4 of students are poor, while only 8% of white students attend such schools. 30% of white students attend low poverty schools, that's less than 25% poor, while only 8% of black students attend such schools. Now, the reason it's related to teacher quality is because I do think high quality teachers are not necessarily as selecting in to the high poverty school districts is often. And there's not the economic incentives with regard to teacher salaries to help spur that change. So thank you for your time.